The North Atlantic in the dead of winter, around the year 1000, towering waves rise like cliffs, slamming into a lone wooden ship as the cold bites harder than steel. Ice clings to every rope, breath solidifies in the wind, and frost locks beards like chains. The sea offers no mercy. These sailors endure weeks of this frozen torment, without walls, shelter, or even a single flame to warm them. Not a spark, no fire, no embers, not even a flickering ember allowed aboard. Yet they survive, and not just survive, conquer, navigate, thrive. The secret to how Viking crews braved such unforgiving waters without a single source of heat defies common sense, and rewrites what we believed about their technology. What archaeologists have uncovered across 8 ancient shipwrecks changes everything. These Norse mariners didn't heat their ships, not with campfires, not with stoves, not even with portable burners. But this wasn't the result of lacking knowledge. It was deliberate design, a carefully chosen approach built on a principle most people today have forgotten: safety before comfort. These methods were so effective, so well thought out, they enabled entire empires to be reached and unknown lands to be discovered. It all begins with a truth that cinema and popular culture often miss entirely. Wooden ships and fire? They're natural enemies. When you travel the open sea inside a vessel crafted entirely of timber, sealed with resin, and held together by tar-soaked rope, lighting a flame is not just a risk. To comfort, it's a threat to survival itself. But how can we be so sure they sailed flame-free? How can we confirm that Viking crews never used fire on their vessels? The ships themselves provide the answer. Timber fossils preserved across centuries, still whispering their secrets. The clearest evidence emerges from the cold waters near Roskilde Fjord, where the remains of 5 Viking ships lay hidden for nearly 1,000 years, untouched. These 5 vessels, comprising warships, cargo haulers, and fishing boats dating from around 1000 to 1070 CE, were pulled from the depths and examined in detail by teams at a leading maritime museum. What they found confirmed what no one wanted to believe: water barrels, tools, cargo stones, even leftover food materials were all intact. But among every vessel, across different types and functions, something vital was missing. No brazier, no fire pit, no oven. No hearth, nothing that could produce or sustain fire, nothing that even hinted at heat. This absence wasn't isolated. It showed up again and again across the archaeological record. The famous burial ship uncovered in 834 CE contained cooking gear, but these were ceremonial objects intended for the dead, not used in actual voyages. Another vessel dating to 890 CE showed advanced water storage systems, yet not a trace of heat equipment. Even the most recent high-tech excavation, carried out just a few years ago using radar and 3D imaging, produced the same result: zero heat infrastructure, no fire. Texts from the Viking Age back this up. Law codes from medieval Norway mandated ship cooks to go ashore 3 times daily, once to fetch water, twice to prepare meals. Sagas speak of food preparation duties being divided among crew, but these efforts took place off the ship, not on it. So it's not just speculation, it's not just absence, it's a pattern. The evidence, material, legal, and literary, aligns perfectly. Viking crews sailed frigid oceans for weeks at a time without ever using fire on board. And the question burns stronger than ever. Why? Why endure bone-cracking cold rather than light a single controlled flame? The clearest confirmations of Viking seafaring life come not from myths or imagination, but from the physical remains that time and earth preserved. Burial grounds and sunken ship hulls speak in silence, but when carefully excavated, their stories ring louder than legend. And across every major Viking ship discovery, one striking absence echoes again and again: no equipment to produce fire. Not one fireplace, not one charcoal pit, not even a simple portable brazier. The most conclusive evidence surfaces from the quiet shores of Roskilde Fjord in Denmark. Here, a remarkable find known as the Skuldelev ships brought 5 vessels back to light after being hidden for nearly 1,000 years beneath layers of silt and water. These weren't identical, clones of each other. They represented a cross-section of Viking naval life. Long warships, cargo, haulers known as nars, fishing boats, and support vessels. Different shapes, sizes, and purposes. And yet, all of them shared the same critical trait: zero heat-based equipment on board. Specialists at the Maritime Museum who led the excavations performed exhaustive checks. They documented every item they unearthed, from the smallest iron nail to entire barrels for holding water. They cataloged tool chests and sail fragments. They tested preserved food, remnants. But when they reviewed their notes and looked again, one glaring omission remained. There were no signs of any heating devices, no cooking systems, no campfire. Substitutes, no stoves. This wasn't an oversight. It was a pattern. The deeper the archaeological record was explored, the stronger this pattern became. Take the Oseberg ship, for example. Dug from a royal burial mound in 1904 and dated to the mid-9th century, the ship was a masterpiece of decorative woodworking, the grave goods buried with. The ship included metal cooking pots, vessels that would have made meal preparation easy on land. But every researcher agreed these were ceremonial objects placed for the afterlife, not items used in actual voyages. Then there's the Gokstad ship, dated to the late 800s. This one was different from the Oseberg find. The Gokstad ship wasn't loaded with treasures or carved with lavish art. It was a working vessel designed for function. In this case, researchers found advanced water collection, systems that allowed the ship to carry large supplies of drinkable liquid. That's no small feat for open sea travel. Yet once again, no heating system, not a brazier, not a firestone, not a fireproof container, just barrels and tools, and again, cold silence. Even in the 21st century, with ground-penetrating radar, 3D modeling, and chemical residue analysis, the same results keep appearing. In 2020 and 2021, archaeologists conducted new, high-resolution surveys at a site known as Gjellestad in Norway. They mapped out a massive Viking ship long hidden underground, scanned it using the most modern tools, and analyzed every potential trace of shipboard life. The outcome? Consistent. There were materials for sailing, sleeping, storing, and steering, but not a single tool for generating heat. When physical evidence from multiple sites, decades apart, and vastly different ship types, all point to the same absence, it's no longer coincidence. It's a tradition. Textual sources, historical, legal, and literary, add their voice to the same chorus. The Gragas, a set of Icelandic legal codes from the medieval period, lays out detailed rules for conduct aboard Viking ships. Among them is a requirement that ship cooks make 3 trips to shore each day, 1 to collect fresh water and 2 for preparing food. The message is unmistakable. Meals were not prepared on the vessel itself, but always ashore. Fires didn't happen on deck. They happened on land. Sagas support this too. In the Erbygja saga, there is mention of crew members drawing lots to determine who would handle food duties. The narrative doesn't describe them gathering around a fire pit mid-ocean. It portrays them going to shore, establishing cooking spaces, and returning with meals. Over and over, references to fire come hand in hand with being off the ship. The consistency extends across geography as well. Whether a ship was uncovered in Denmark, Norway, or Iceland, whether the excavation took place in 1905 or 2021, the absence of heat systems on board is universal. Some skeptics once wondered whether smaller portable heating devices might simply have vanished with time, perhaps stolen, rotted away, or disintegrated beyond recognition. But other fragile materials, wooden tools, rope fibers, even traces of food, have survived in those same ships. If fire-based tools were ever used, traces would remain. Metal brazier remnants, scorched. Wood, charred surfaces. Archaeologists know how to find such clues. They simply don't exist on these ships. Even more telling is the fact that heat-producing tools and fire-optimized equipment do appear. In Viking longhouses and encampments discovered along coastlines, soapstone pots with high thermal efficiency, suspended cooking tripods designed for hearth use, chain systems meant to hang kettles above an open flame. These technologies were well developed and widespread, but they stayed on land. They never migrated to the boats. This contrast is telling. The Vikings clearly possessed the knowledge, the tools, and the materials to create safe cooking systems, but they made the deliberate choice not to use them aboard their vessels. This choice becomes even more meaningful when considering the nature of Viking ship design. Open-deck vessels without bulkheads, without fireproofing, without cabins to contain heat or restrict airflow. These ships offered nowhere to hide a fire, no safe corner in which to keep a flame from spreading, and they were built for movement, for landing on beaches, navigating shallow rivers, crossing vast distances, carrying flammable materials in a container of flammable materials simply wasn't a gamble worth taking. All the facts point in the same direction. The absence of fire at sea was not an accident. It was policy. It was architecture, it was culture, and it raises the next great question. If Viking sailors truly lived without heat for weeks at sea, what replaced it? What systems did they build instead? Biological, mechanical, social, to withstand temperatures that modern people find intolerable? The answers lie deeper still in the textile innovations, sleeping strategies, and food systems that made the impossible voyage survivable. To understand why fire was not only absent but actively avoided on Viking ships, we must first understand the ships themselves. These weren't massive galleons with multiple decks, fire-resistant compartments, or dedicated quarters. Viking vessels were open from bow to stern, sleek, powerful, but dangerously exposed. The very design that made them fast and agile also made them vulnerable to the smallest ember. Their construction method, known as clinker building, was based on overlapping wooden planks, fastened together with iron rivets and sealed with natural resins. Gaps between these planks were packed with animal wool, moss, or tar-soaked fibers to block leaks. The ropes that held everything together were treated with pitch. The sails, made from tightly woven wool, were often coated in animal fats or oils to make them more resistant to moisture, an advantage against rain, but a terrifying liability around fire. In other words, Viking ships were floating tinderboxes. Every inch of their surface contained some flammable material. The hull, the rigging, the tarred ropes, the grease-lined sail, even the personal gear of the crew, all of it could ignite in seconds. And in the absence of sealed rooms or dividing bulkheads, there was no physical barrier to contain a flame once it started. One spark wasn't a minor concern. It was a full-scale catastrophe in waiting. Later ships from the Age of Sail included fire breaks and lower decks, giving crews at least some chance to isolate and extinguish flames, but Viking vessels had no such luxury. They were essentially enormous wooden canoes, scaled up for sea travel and war. Once fire took hold on a Viking ship, there was no stopping it. It would race from bow to stern in mere moments. Experts in maritime archaeology estimate that a blaze on such a ship, given the tar, the pitch, and the fat-treated materials, could consume the vessel entirely in under 4 minutes. Think of that. Not 4 hours, 4 minutes. From a single spark to an unstoppable inferno. There were no fireproof linings, no sand buckets, no containment zones, and no way to isolate one area of the ship from another. The same open construction that allowed for fast loading and rapid beach landings also ensured that flame could travel unimpeded. The situation was made worse by the storage systems on board. Viking ships carried their provisions, tools, sails, weapons, and personal belongings all in a shared space. The cargo wasn't tucked below a sealed deck. It was laid out, wrapped, and covered, but still exposed to air and sun. Tucking a live flame among these supplies, even in the coldest weather, would be akin to sleeping inside a fuel tank with a candle. Archaeologists have confirmed the absence of any protective architecture that might suggest an attempt to control fire. There are no signs of metal linings, stone hearth bases, or insulated fire zones. And critically, there are no burn marks, none of the telltale scorching that would linger on planks or beams if fires had been lit routinely. What we find instead is the meticulous preservation of planks that were never charred, ropes never singed, and sails never scorched. In some ways, the silence of the evidence is the loudest voice. Fires leave scars. They leave residues and discoloration. None of these exist on the recovered ship fragments. Even traces of soot, a substance that embeds into wood grain and hides in crevices, are absent. This absence is not just a clue, it's confirmation. But the danger wasn't theoretical. The sagas themselves describe the horror of shipboard fires, not as common events, but as disasters that struck with terrible consequence. Accounts speak of entire fleets lost when a cooking flame was mishandled during landing, of crews leaping overboard as the decks beneath their feet caught fire. These stories were not cautionary fables. They were real incidents etched into memory, reinforcing why fire on board was not tolerated. It's important to understand this wasn't due to a lack of technology. As we've seen, the Vikings had access to advanced cooking systems on land. They could smelt iron, build hearths with airflow control, even design chimney structures in their longhouses. The choice not to bring this technology aboard the ship wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of necessity. The logic was ruthless but effective. Avoid the single greatest threat to the ship's survival. Cold could be endured, hunger could be planned for, but fire? Fire was not a risk they were willing to take. Every element of Viking ship life was shaped by this awareness. The gear they carried, the food they packed, the materials they used to clothe themselves. Every system had to compensate for the absence of heat, and instead of relying on fire to preserve life at sea, they turned to innovation elsewhere, through what they wore, how they slept, and what they ate. Fire was the forbidden element, not for ritual reasons, not for superstition, but because the very vessels that made Viking expansion possible were simply too vulnerable to survive its presence. Flame was the one thing their ships could not tolerate, and so it was exiled from their seafaring world. Without access to fire and with no walls or cabins to shield them, Viking sailors were left with only one defense against the deadly cold of the open sea: their own garments. But far from the crude pelts and shaggy furs often shown in television or films, the reality was far more advanced. Viking cold-weather clothing was not a patchwork of animal hides thrown together. It was a deliberately engineered, multi-layered system that modern archaeologists now recognize as a marvel of functional textile design. What made Viking clothing systems so unique was their ability to perform in the worst of maritime conditions. These garments had to retain heat, shed water, resist wind, and continue functioning even when soaked. And yet they did, all without synthetics, Gore-Tex, or modern insulation. The secret was wool, not just any wool, but hand-spun, carefully graded and treated. Wool tailored for different performance needs. Archaeological digs in Greenland, particularly at the site of Herjolfsnes, have uncovered an astonishing array of preserved Viking garments. These finds have revealed details that were never recorded in sagas or legal texts. Triple-layer tunics with different densities of weave, outer garments treated with natural oils, underlayers designed specifically to trap air close to the body. Some layers prioritized wind resistance, others prioritized moisture management. The result was a living insulation system, what researchers now call a portable microclimate. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery involves the wrists. In a detail almost too specific to invent, multiple sources, including sagas and surviving clothing, describe a practice so disciplined, so methodical, that it could only have emerged from brutal necessity. Every morning aboard the ship, before the day's voyage began, women on the crew, or in some accounts fellow crewmates, would use waxed thread and bone, needles to sew each man's sleeves shut at the wrist. These weren't tied, cuffed, or buttoned. They were sealed tight, threaded shut. The goal was simple: trap every degree of body heat and prevent warm air from escaping through the wrists. Before combat or docking at shore, the men would cut themselves free using their short blades. The ritual happened daily. Each time they resealed the sleeves, it was a small task with massive impact, part of a broader strategy to survive the cold, not by resisting it, but by neutralizing its access points. Clothing wasn't only a matter of warmth, it was a system of survival. In Greenlandic burial sites, archaeologists discovered garments made not just from wool, but from fur-lined animal skins and carefully sewn layers of bear skin and seal skin. These were not crude cloaks. They were tailored garments, many featuring stitched reinforcement at pressure, points, fur sewn inward for insulation, and overlapping panels to break wind. Some had been repaired multiple times, a sign of their value, and the lengths crews went to preserve them. The layering system was anything but random. The innermost layers hugged the skin and wicked away moisture, fine wool that breathed. The middle layers trapped air, offering insulation. The outermost layers blocked the wind and repelled sea spray. Even when soaked, wool continued to insulate, a property unmatched by cotton or linen, and one that became critical in storms or long rains. Each layer had a role, and together they formed a complete, wearable climate system. This wasn't limited to a few elite warriors or chieftains. Evidence suggests this system was widespread. Garments with similar construction have been found across multiple excavation sites. And more importantly, the texts, the sagas and oral histories, indicate this was cultural practice, not luxury. Clothing became a kind of armor against the elements, but even the most sophisticated textiles had their limits, especially when night fell and body temperatures dropped. Without movement, even the best wool began to lose its edge. And that's where the Vikings once again proved their ingenuity, by finding warmth not just in materials, but in each other. This leads to their next innovation: communal sleeping systems. But before that, it's worth understanding what this tells us about the Viking worldview. They didn't try to bend nature to their will. They didn't force the cold to retreat with fire or metal. They adapted, they studied, they cooperated, and they evolved solutions based not on conquest of the elements, but on understanding them. By modern standards, their gear might look simple, but by function, by design, and by necessity, it achieved what no fire ever could: survival at sea, day after day, week after week, in temperatures that kill modern people in hours. When the biting cold intensified, when breath turned to frost and even layered wool offered little comfort, the Vikings turned to a method of warmth far more intimate than any fire could provide. It wasn't technology in the modern sense. It wasn't a tool or a weapon. It was human connection. precisely organized, ritualized, and implemented to maximum thermal efficiency. Forget the dramatic lone warrior wrapped in a fur blanket under the stars, the real Viking. Experience was far more practical. They slept in pairs, close, coordinated, and covered, not out of comfort, but out of strategy. Across multiple sagas and supported by burial finds, this practice of communal rest was not rare or reserved for emergencies. It was routine. The sleeping system they developed was based on what the old texts refer to as weather bags, or skin sacks. These were not simply cloaks or animal hides thrown together. They were purpose-built containers for shared warmth, likely the same items referenced in the prose. Edda under the term hudfat. These sheepskin-based sacks were lined with fur and waterproofed with natural oils. Their design allowed two people to climb inside, fully clothed, and retain body heat between them. The effectiveness of this system was extraordinary. Just two bodies in one of these bags could raise the internal temperature by 15 to 20 degrees above the surrounding air using nothing but their own shared warmth. In the harsh North Atlantic, that difference could mean the line between survival and death. These weren't luxury items. They were standard kit. Maritime dig sites reveal evidence that these shared sleeping bags were common, brought aboard in sets and assigned according to rotating duty schedules. In fact, the Landnámabók, one of the most detailed Icelandic sagas, explains how crew members were paired not based on friendship or rank, but on watch shifts. While one stood guard or rowed, the other rested, ensuring that at all times the bag itself remained warm and ready. This rotation system preserved heat even more efficiently. When the first man left for duty, he left behind residual warmth. When the second climbed in, he didn't start from frozen cloth and cold air. He stepped into a partially heated environment. The sleeping space never cooled entirely. It was a cycle of continuous thermal transfer, enhanced by timing and discipline. Sleeping quarters on the ships themselves were as carefully considered as their clothing and food. Reconstructed vessels and archaeological notes suggest crews didn't sleep on the deck or directly on the hull. Instead, they laid planks across the rowing benches, creating elevated platforms. These platforms raised them just high enough to avoid the coldest air trapped near the bilge, the ship's lowest and dampest part. Above them, the sail itself played a dual role. When not in use, it could be lowered and spread over the ship like a canopy, forming a loose tent. This covering trapped warm air produced by the bodies below and blocked wind chill from above. In a ship carrying 20 to 30 people, that shared warmth added up quickly. The entire vessel became a floating, heat-conserving bubble, not cozy by modern standards, but life-saving in conditions where even modern gear would struggle. It's important to note that no one, not even the ship's commander, was exempt from this routine. The sagas make it clear. Everyone slept in pairs. Everyone followed the same cycles. On land, Viking society was hierarchical. At sea, survival was democratic. Status gave way to strategy. Their approach to nighttime warmth wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The closeness of sleeping arrangements created camaraderie. It demanded trust. You couldn't fake resilience. You had to contribute to the shared system or put your partner at risk. This type of enforced mutual reliance likely played a significant role in crew cohesion and morale, something we'll explore further later. And what about those on watch? The men who weren't sleeping still had to function in sub-zero temperatures. Their warmth came from movement and layering. They stayed active, often rotated out every couple of hours, and were encouraged to stay in close contact with others still awake. Some accounts even suggest shared huddling during watch, particularly during storms, though these claims are harder to verify archaeologically. Together, this entire system, double sleeping sacks, elevated platforms, sail canopy coverings, and shift-based heat rotation was as much a technological solution as any furnace. It worked, not because it fought the cold, but because it embraced the reality of exposure and found balance within it. No fire, no wood smoke, no scorched beams or risky sparks, just bodies, wool, fur, and discipline. A 1,000-year-old example of environmental adaptation at its finest. Heat from the body could be preserved with wool and shared sleeping spaces, but internal heat, fuel for muscles, warmth from digestion, required food. High-calorie, nutrient-dense, long-lasting food. And if fire was banned from the deck, Viking crews had only one option: eat. Everything cold. It wasn't a limitation, it was a strategy. Viking provisioning was built for one thing: endurance at sea without flame. Every item in their food system was designed to travel long distances, survive exposure to salt air and moisture, and deliver fuel without preparation. And it worked. One of the central foods in this survival plan was dried fish. It's not glamorous, it's not delicious, but it was the perfect food. Dried properly, fish could last for months without spoiling. Packed into linen sacks, tied off with twine and stored near the water barrels, it became the backbone of every long journey. Even after soaking in salt air and sea spray, it remained edible, chewy, tough, but edible. Alongside it were biscuits, hard, compact, calorie-heavy bread made without moisture. These were not the flaky pastries of a modern bakery. They were tough as stone, designed to resist. Molding, known in some texts as ship's bread or nut loaves, these dense food blocks could be dipped in water to soften slightly, or chewed dry if no liquid was available. Then there was porridge, but not the warm kind. The Icelandic texts describe a system of cold porridge made in bulk before voyages began. This meal was prepared with grains, butter, and salt. Left to cool, it congealed into a dense paste that could be scooped out, eaten with fingers, or a flat spoon, and required no heating. Some versions included milk or even fermented dairy, adding fat and protein to stretch its sustenance. It was heavy, bland, and almost impossible to spoil. This porridge was ingenious. It offered flexibility. Mixed with cold water, it became a drinkable slurry. Eaten as is, it was a slow-release fuel, and when combined with dried fruit or nuts, it gave the sailors both taste and energy in a compact form. Most importantly, it provided consistent calories, necessary for preserving body heat and muscle function in freezing conditions. Historians estimate that a Viking sailor required anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day while at sea. This wasn't luxury, it was survival. Between rowing, standing watch, enduring the cold, and carrying gear, the energy expenditure was enormous, and every bite of food had to be ready, safe, and cold. At trading outposts like Hedeby, researchers have uncovered direct evidence of this. Provisioning. Excavations revealed storage jars with dried and salted meats, baskets for carrying nuts and seeds, and remnants of porridge mixture still stuck to the inside of containers. These weren't leftovers, they were clues. Clues to a strategy that emphasized durability over comfort, practicality over variety. The most impressive part? These weren't emergency rations. This was their standard diet for sea travel. This wasn't a fallback plan, it was the plan. Even more revealing are the provisioning systems uncovered in York, one of the largest Norse settlements outside Scandinavia. Storage sites there held massive amounts of dried fish, hard, bread and cheese that had undergone fermentation, a method that reduced spoilage and increased shelf life. These finds showed not only what they ate, but how they thought. Provisioning wasn't a last-minute effort before sailing. It was a calculated, pre-planned logistics system, one that mirrored modern military food strategy more than medieval guesswork. What's also clear is that taste was secondary. There are no sagas filled with poetic descriptions. Of shipboard meals, no feasts mid-ocean. These were meals for function. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to stay alive. Even the distribution system had logic. Foods with more fat and calories were consumed before the colder nighttime watches. Lighter meals were used during rowing shifts. The calorie scheduling, though not described in scientific terms, followed the same principles we use today. For energy cycling and workload fueling, it's easy to imagine the crew tearing open sacks, breaking bread with a stone, sipping cold water from shared wooden ladles. There was no fire, no warm broth, no steam in the air, just grit, hands, teeth, and routine. And every item they ate had been chosen not just to nourish, but to withstand weeks of brutal conditions without turning rotten. This food culture wasn't just a workaround, it was a maritime tradition. And it leads to a deeper truth. Viking endurance was not accidental. It wasn't a product of genetic toughness or cultural superstition. It was built carefully, step by step, through gear, through knowledge, through diet. Every item on board was chosen to serve a role in the larger system of survival without flame. The idea that Viking crews were alone at sea for months on end is a myth. They may have crossed vast oceans and braved bitter winds, but they were never far from their most powerful asset, land-based infrastructure. Far from being reckless nomads adrift in icy waters, they were master planners, relying on a vast network of coastal camps, harbors, and temporary settlements that served as the backbone of their maritime strategy. Recent archaeological surveys across northern Europe have completely redefined how we understand Viking navigation. Along the coasts of Scandinavia, the British Isles, and even as far west as North America, researchers have now cataloged over 200 separate sites that acted as stops, shelters, and seasonal bases for Viking ships. These weren't just natural harbors. They were built environments, engineered for one thing: support. Nowhere is this clearer than at Torksey in modern-day England, excavated in stages between 2009 and 2017 by teams from the universities of York and Sheffield. The site revealed something astonishing: an overwintering camp so large it spanned more than 55 hectares, an area capable of housing hundreds of warriors, support staff, and their families. This wasn't a rough collection of tents. It was an organized operation. Foundations showed long halls for sleeping, hearths for communal meals, workshops for blacksmithing and repair. There were child-sized remains, animal pens, even traces of long-term food storage. This was no raid camp. It was a winter base of operations, equipped with everything the crews needed to refit, rest, and prepare for their next move. And this site wasn't unique. Similar coastal outposts have been found from Ireland to northern France. Some were fortified, some were semi-permanent. All shared key traits: protection from wind and weather, access to fresh water, and land-based fire systems for cooking, warmth, and tool work. These land-based operations explain a major mystery: why, despite having access to sophisticated hearth technology, the Vikings never brought it aboard their ships. It wasn't because they couldn't. It's because they didn't need to. Longhouses from places like Borg in the Lofoten Islands showcase an extraordinary knowledge of airflow management. Central hearths were placed in precise alignment with roof ventilation to channel smoke upward without suffocating the room. Some even used stone-lined pits to retain heat for hours after the fire was out. Soapstone vessels, iron cauldrons suspended from custom, chains, and multi-level cooking surfaces all appeared in these structures. In other words, the Vikings knew how to heat a room, boil water, and cook food with incredible efficiency, but all of it stayed ashore. Why? Because using those tools aboard a wooden ship with no containment or separation would have been suicidal. So instead, they created a rhythm, sail during weather windows, stop often, cook on land, sleep ashore when possible, use the sea not as a permanent home, but as a corridor, a connector, a means to move between pre-prepared posts that offered warmth, safety, and food. Evidence from the Viking Coastal Archaeology project confirms this pattern. Along the Norwegian coastline alone, over 60 such sites have been documented. In Iceland, dozens more, and in Greenland, where the environment was even more extreme. The remains of winter, camps show an even higher reliance on onshore heating and communal fire use. These bases weren't scattered randomly. They were placed with care, each within reasonable sailing distance of the next, offering refuge when the sea turned rough or the wind shifted against them. Some researchers have gone as far as calling these coastal networks the Vikings' hidden empire. An empire not of cities or castles, but of staging grounds, places designed not to hold land, but to support movement. The scale of planning behind these stops also hints at something deeper, a culture that valued sustainability. Viking voyages weren't reckless sprints into the unknown. They were carefully timed, logistically supported operations. Crews could land, resupply, cook warm meals, repair ships, and even rotate out injured members or rest sick ones. They operated with the kind of foresight you'd expect from a professional expedition, not a band of raiders. And this network extended farther than once believed. In Newfoundland, at the site of Lens, or Meadows, traces of Norse buildings, longhouses, workshops, even a forge, confirm that these support systems reached across the Atlantic. Though only seasonally occupied, the presence of fire-based infrastructure in these outposts once again proves the pattern. Land for fire, sea for strategy. This division of space between warmth and mobility, safety and speed, is what made Viking maritime culture so effective. Their refusal to heat their ships wasn't an oversight. It was a component of a broader system in which ships were always supported, never isolated. Their camps were their hearths, their outposts were their kitchens, and their routes were carefully designed to connect these lifelines into a functional, far-reaching web of survival. It's easy to assume that the absence of fire aboard Viking ships was the result of limitations, of lacking the knowledge or tools to make shipboard heat a reality. But that assumption couldn't be more wrong. The truth is far more revealing. They didn't avoid onboard heating because they couldn't do it. They avoided it because they chose not to. Other civilizations during the same period had already developed methods for warming and cooking at sea. Mediterranean cultures in particular, sailing calmer, warmer waters, had the advantage of enclosed decks, stable platforms, and different materials. And they used them. Roman naval archaeology shows ships equipped with bronze braziers, portable fire devices, designed for controlled use on deck. These vessels also featured galley areas with protective stone linings and designated cooking spaces. The use of slow-burning charcoal and low flame containment made limited fire use possible, even underway. Heat didn't spread quickly because of how the ships were built, and because the sea they sailed was far less violent. Later, Byzantine vessels took this further. Underwater excavations of sunken Byzantine merchant ships show clear evidence of onboard heating systems, designated ventilation areas, clay-lined stove bases, and even chimney structures built into the ship's superstructure. Their ships weren't just warmer, they were built with fire in mind. Their architecture made it possible. But this technology didn't transfer to the north. Viking vessels were built differently, open, low to the water, flexible in the hull for rapid maneuvering and beach landings. There were no decks to insulate heat or contain flame, and the materials, pitch-soaked ropes, wool sails, tarred seams, would have turned any flame into catastrophe. But even more importantly, Viking seafarers had seen these other systems. They weren't cut off from the world. They traded, raided, and interacted with Mediterranean cultures. They visited ports where onboard fire was used. They knew it was possible. They simply decided it wasn't worth the risk. And they weren't alone in this logic. Anglo-Saxon and Frisian vessels from the same time period used in northern Europe follow the exact same pattern. Shipwrecks from these cultures show no signs of shipboard heating. Their crews, like the Norse, relied on cold food, land-based cooking, and careful route planning. These weren't isolated practices. They were part of a regional maritime logic. Speed and safety outweighed onboard comfort. What stands out most is the consistency of this pattern. Across cultures that faced cold seas, stormy conditions, and unpredictable weather, fire was universally excluded from vessels. The difference wasn't technological, it was environmental. The Mediterranean was mild, calm, and supported longer stretches at sea without landfall. Northern waters were brutal, icy, and demanded frequent stops, and Viking ships, designed for those waters, were tuned for agility and speed, not heat retention. Choosing not to install heating wasn't a flaw in Viking engineering, it was a feature. By refusing to carry heavy fire gear, they saved weight, critical in an environment where speed often meant survival. Less weight meant more space for supplies, more flexibility in combat or retreat, and better handling in rough water. And removing the fire hazard entirely meant fewer accidental disasters at sea. This decision also allowed Viking ships to retain their open structure, which made fast landings possible. Raiders could pull into shallow beaches, unload in minutes, and retreat before resistance could arrive. The same openness that made fire impossible also made this kind of lightning-fast mobility possible. In short, the Vikings had a choice: warmth or speed, safety or risk. They chose mastery of movement, and they designed their entire cold survival system around that choice, investing in textiles, shore camps, provisioning systems, and shared heat practices instead of gambling on the unpredictable nature of fire at sea. To modernize, this trade-off seems brutal, but from a strategic perspective, it was elegant. They made their ships into tools of expansion, not homes, not fortresses, just vessels, fast, quiet, and ruthlessly efficient. It's not that they couldn't survive with heat, it's that they had found a better way. The Viking methods for surviving the cold without fire might seem extreme, even impossible by today's standards. But one question remained unanswered for centuries: could modern people endure the same journey using only historical Viking techniques? No heaters, no synthetic gear, no shortcuts? In 2007, a group of maritime historians and archaeologists decided to find out. The experiment was simple in concept, but ambitious in scope. Take a full-scale replica of a Viking ship, built according to ancient specifications, rigged with traditional sails and oars, and sail it from Denmark to Ireland, retracing one of the known Norse routes across the North Sea. The ship they used was a reconstruction of a Skuldelev-class vessel, crafted with authentic materials and methods. No motors, no cabins, no hidden heaters, and most importantly, no fire. This test voyage, organized and documented by the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, became a living laboratory. The crew followed strict rules. Wear only wool-based clothing modeled after archaeological finds, sleep in paired arrangements using shared animal skin bags, and rely exclusively on preserved cold food for energy. The conditions were brutal. Even in summer, the North Sea can be unforgiving. Temperatures dropped sharply at night. Rain soaked every surface. Winds battered the open hull, and waves crashed over the gunwales. But through it all, the crew endured. And more than that, they proved the old ways worked. Core body temperatures remained within safe limits, thanks to the layered wool garments that continued to insulate even when wet. The communal sleeping system, 2 people in each bag, rotating shifts, kept warmth trapped in the enclosed space, just as described in the sagas. The sail, lowered over the crew at night, captured shared body heat and turned the ship itself into a makeshift shelter. But warmth alone wasn't enough. The mental burden of constant exposure, of knowing there would be no heat, no warm meal, no reprieve, was immense. And it's here that another Viking secret came into focus: the importance of morale. The archaeological record has long suggested that Viking crews invested in more than just physical survival. Over 50 ship camps and settlements have yielded evidence of carved game, pieces, dice, and board games. These weren't childish distractions. They were tools, psychological tools. The researchers noted the same effect during the modern voyage. When spirits dipped, when bodies grew cold and minds grew numb, it was shared games, storytelling, and humor that kept the crew going. A carved piece passed between hands, a challenge issued over a game board, laughter echoing in the wind. These moments weren't luxuries, they were fuel for the will to endure. This dynamic, what some researchers now call psychological thermogenesis, isn't about physical heat at all. It's about maintaining enough mental resilience that the body continues to function even when external conditions press in. The Vikings may not have had this terminology, but they understood the effect, and they structured their shipboard culture around it. Even the structure of the voyage itself reflected this insight. Viking ships didn't just head out into the unknown. Their journeys were timed, carefully planned to avoid the worst weather. They operated within seasonal windows, choosing routes that allowed regular contact with land and access to support stations. The 2007 experiment mirrored this, sailing during a calculated period when weather conditions made the crossing survivable. This wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. The Vikings weren't trying to defy nature. They were working with it, leveraging what they knew about wind, tides, and seasonal shifts to navigate vast distances without pushing into the realm of catastrophe. The results of the modern test voyage surprised even the researchers. Not only did the crew survive, but they did so with minimal incidents of illness, no serious cold-related injuries, and a deeper appreciation for the systems that had once powered an entire civilization's expansion. The takeaway was profound. Viking survival wasn't brute endurance. It was design. It was cooperation. It was logistics. It was culture. They didn't just wear warm clothes. They knew how to repair them, layer them, and seal them daily. They didn't just eat preserved food. They prepared it with preservation in mind, months ahead of travel. They didn't just sleep beside each other. They organized heat-sharing systems around duty cycles and social bonds, and they didn't just pass the time. They engineered morale into the rhythm of their days. All of it. Every stitch of wool, every rotation schedule, every carved dice served a purpose. And when the modern crew stepped ashore in Dublin, cold and tired but alive and whole, they had done more than complete a journey. They had validated an ancient system that worked not because of luck, but because of strategic brilliance. The image of the Viking as a brute, shoulders hunched against the wind, pushing through snow, and sea spray with little more than rage and instinct, is incomplete. It sells the drama, it fits the myth, but it erases the most powerful truth. The Vikings didn't conquer the cold with brute strength, they outthought it. From shipbuilding to food systems, from layered garments to psychological endurance, every element of their maritime life was structured, tested, and refined. They didn't light fires aboard their ships, not because they lacked fire, but because they understood risk. They saw the design of their vessels not as a weakness to be ignored, but a reality to be solved through new systems. And so they invented warmth without flame. They built routines around the human body. They developed rotating sleep patterns and social systems that generated and preserved heat. They cooked before sailing, planned for every mile, and constructed a culture that could endure the elements through preparation, not pain. They chose discomfort when necessary. They sacrificed convenience for security. And they created networks of coastal camps, seasonal bases, and inland supply routes that allowed them to survive and even thrive while doing what no one else dared, crossing frozen seas in open boats, reaching shores no one thought possible. They made the Longship not a floating fortress, but a tool optimized for speed, precision, and silence. They made the sea not an enemy to be conquered, but a highway to be mapped. They didn't seek comfort, they sought mobility, and in that trade-off, they reshaped human geography. They reached North America centuries before others. They opened trade routes from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. They influenced kingdoms through movement, not just muscle. They did. All of it without fire aboard their ships. Their legacy is not just in the artifacts they left behind or the sagas that bear their names. It's in the system they built, a self-sufficient, cold-adapted, sea-spanning machine made of wool, discipline, and community. And it holds a lesson. Today, when the weather turns and we instinctively reach for buttons, car heaters, thermostats, electric blankets, it's easy to forget what the human body can endure when properly equipped and supported. The Viking answer to cold wasn't technology. It was cooperation, planning, adaptation, and a refusal to accept risk when a smarter solution could be found. They didn't beat the winter, they became part of it. They didn't insulate their ships, they insulated their lives, and in doing so, they crossed oceans with no fire, only each other, their knowledge, and their willingness to change. That is the real story. Not of frozen warriors hardened by suffering, but of brilliant engineers in wool and wood who didn't just survive the cold, they mastered it.